Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into a conflict born not from choice, but from betrayal. The 2026 border war between Pakistan and Afghanistan, a war that Pakistan says it was absolutely forced to fight.
To really get a handle on this, you have to picture it. A nation of 240 million people basically on edge. From their point of view, this wasn't about choosing to go to war. It was about responding to a relentless, escalating threat that was coming from right across its border.
And that's the phrase you hear over and over again, a war of necessity. This wasn't framed as an act of aggression, not at all. It was a defensive move to protect its citizens, its soldiers, and its own sovereignty from attacks pouring in from Afghanistan.
So let's start with that, a war of necessity. We're going to look at the exact moment when years of what Pakistan called strategic restraint just snapped. It forced them into a state of open war, kicking off a critical new operation.
The operation's name was Ghazab Lil-Haq, which translates to the wrath of truth. And that name tells you a lot, doesn't it? It suggests a response not just to the violence from groups like the TTP and the BLA, but to what they saw as a campaign of lies and a deep, fundamental betrayal of trust.
All right, Section 2, Data of the Terror. Let's look at the actual numbers that pushed Pakistan to this breaking point. Because behind all the politics, there's some really hard data points that tell a pretty grim story of a nation feeling like it was under siege.
And you can see on this timeline just how fast things went downhill. It starts on January 29th, with a wave of sophisticated, coordinated attacks ripping across the country. This wasn't random. It was an organized surge that ended in open war by the middle of February.
Just in that month, in February, 13 soldiers were killed. And you have to remember, that's just a snapshot. This number is part of a much larger toll, hundreds of casualties over the last year, a cost that Pakistan argues was a direct result of its neighbor refusing to act. And here it is, the absolute crucial finding from Pakistani intelligence. These attacks were not homegrown. They were, in their words, exported, planned, supplied, and launched from safe havens inside Afghanistan cities. So, that brings us to the ethical heart of this conflict. From Pakistan's point of view, this was way more than just a security crisis. It was a violation of sacred Islamic principles. It was about promises broken between neighbors.
Now, this is really fascinating. There's this principle called Huquq-ul-Jiraar. The Prophet Muhammad stressed this right so heavily that his followers actually thought neighbors might get inheritance rights. It's a cornerstone of how a community should function.
And then there's the concept of Fitna, basically chaos or sedition. The TTP's actions are seen as a textbook example of creating fasad fil ardh, which means corruption in the land. And under Islamic law, it's very clear, you do not give sanctuary to people spreading that kind of chaos.
And finally, you have mithaq, a sacred covenant, a solemn promise. The Doha Agreement, in this view, was a mithaq. It was a promise that Afghan soil would never be used to attack other countries. So breaking it wasn't just a political misstep, it was a profound ethical failure.
And this slide really just brings it all together, doesn't it? From Pakistan's perspective, you're looking at a threefold betrayal: violating the rights of a neighbor, enabling absolute chaos, and breaking a sacred pact. It was seen as a moral failure on just about every level.
So how did Pakistan respond to all this? Well, the military action they took was framed not as an act of aggression, but as Rad al-Zom, a necessary response to oppression.
The operation seems to have focused heavily on being precise. The data they released shows a really clear intent to dismantle the infrastructure of terror, targeting insurgent posts and key militant locations where these attacks were being planned and launched from.
And this is where the war of words, the war of narratives, really heats up. Kabul claimed that civilian medical sites were hit, but Pakistani intelligence came back and said no, those were the same locations that had been repurposed as hubs for treating and rearming TTP fighters. A complete contradiction.
But look, even a war of necessity has a heavy price. And it's a burden that Pakistan says it never ever wanted, but is now being forced to carry almost completely on its own.
A humanitarian crisis is already unfolding. We're talking more than 3,000 Pakistani citizens who've been forced to flee their homes right near the border. They've become refugees in their own country, displaced by a conflict they see as being imported from next door. I mean, the sheer weight of this burden is just immense. You've got a new humanitarian crisis piling on top of a massive strain on an economy that's already battling inflation. And yet, from Pakistan's point of view, it's a duty. It's something that has to be seen through for the long-term security of the nation.
And all of this leaves us with the one somber question at the very heart of this conflict. When a neighbor's sanctuary becomes your nation's siege, what is the real price of security? It's a question with no easy answers, one that forces a nation to calculate the painful, painful cost of survival.